November 6th, 1943, Eastern Front. Somewhere over the vast frozen plains near Vitebsk, the morning sky is a dull silver, streaked with thin clouds that promise snow. Beneath them, the black scars of burned villages stretch for miles. Engines cough in the distance, the sound of men about to gamble their lives once again. Erich Ruderfer adjusts his gloves inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-190A6. The metal canopy seals shut with a sharp clang, trapping him in a world of vibration and noise. He is 28 years old, a veteran by Luftwaffe standards, and to many of the younger pilots around him, already too old to keep up. His squadron, 2 JG-54, Grünherz, is tired, outnumbered, and short on fuel. Soviet fighters now flood the skies daily, their numbers overwhelming, their pilots growing bolder. The control tower crackles through the radio. "Fein in der Luft! Staffel starten! Enemy in the air! Squadron, take off!" Ruderfer presses the throttle forward. The propeller roars. Snow whips beneath the wheels as the fighter lifts into the pale morning light. Within 1 week, this man, dismissed, forgotten, will shoot down 27 enemy aircraft. And in doing so, he will etch his name into the most brutal ledger of aerial warfare ever written. By late 1943, the air war over Europe and the Eastern Front had changed beyond recognition. The golden days of the Luftwaffe, when German pilots ruled the skies with unmatched precision and fearsome machines, were gone. The year had begun with catastrophe. The Sixth Army had been encircled and annihilated at Stalingrad. Across the snow-choked plains of Russia, the myth of German invincibility had shattered. Soviet industry, once thought incapable of matching the Reich's mechanical power, was now producing aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. The Red Air Force was learning and adapting at a pace that stunned German intelligence. In the West, the Allies bombed German cities almost nightly. In the East, the Soviet counteroffensive roared forward like a steel tide. By summer, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in human history, had ended in another German failure. From that point onward, every German advance became a retreat, and every victory a delay. For the Luftwaffe, the skies had become a graveyard. Pilots were no longer gods of war. They were survivors, flying until fuel ran out or wings were torn apart by Soviet flak. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, once the symbol of German superiority, now faced swarms of Yak-9s, LA-55s, and the dreaded Il-2 Sturmovik, Soviet machines that might not have looked elegant, but were deadly in their simplicity and numbers. In this collapsing empire of air, experience was a double-edged sword. Veteran pilots, those who had fought since 1939, were few. Most had died over France, North Africa, or the steppes. Those who survived were exhausted, flying multiple sorties per day, sometimes 6 or 7 in a single 24-hour period. Erich Ruderfer was one of them. He had begun his career long before the Eastern Front consumed Europe. He had flown over France in 1940, over the deserts of North Africa, and now over the ice and mud of Russia. He had seen every color of sky the war could offer. The burning orange over El Alamein, the pale gray over Moscow, the black smoke over Berlin. By 1943, Ruderfer's record was impressive, more than 100 confirmed victories. But numbers meant little to the new generation of Luftwaffe commanders. The Reich wanted youth, speed, and blind aggression. Men like Ruderfer, experienced but outspoken, were often sidelined or reassigned as instructors, sent to train boys who barely knew how to land a plane. It was a time when arrogance replaced judgment, and ideology replaced experience. Inside command rooms, the Luftwaffe was fracturing. Hermann Göring's leadership had become erratic. His promises of total air victory were now hollow. Fuel shortages crippled training programs, spare parts were scarce, and the frontline squadrons were often forced to cannibalize wrecked planes just to keep one airworthy. Still, on the front lines, men like Ruderfer kept flying, not for Göring, not for Hitler, but for the man beside them in the next aircraft, and for the grim instinct of survival. By autumn 1943, Ruderfer found himself reassigned once again, this time to JG-54, the Green Hearts Squadron, one of the Luftwaffe's most battle-hardened fighter wings. Based on the Eastern Front, they were constantly engaged in defensive patrols and ground attack missions against Soviet armor columns pushing west. Here, the airfields were primitive, little more than frozen mud strips. Pilots slept in makeshift huts, their planes often buried in snow until morning. Each mission was a gamble. Soviet anti-aircraft fire and roving fighter patrols made every sortie a potential last one. But the Eastern Front had one strange rule. For those who survived long enough, it could also be a place of legend. The endless Soviet formations gave experienced German pilots opportunities for staggering kill counts, if they could endure the fatigue, cold, and chaos. And Ruderfer was about to prove that endurance was his greatest weapon. In early November 1943, the Soviets launched a large-scale air assault in support of their ground offensive near Vitebsk. Dozens of Soviet squadrons flew daily, escorting bombers, strafing German positions, and challenging Luftwaffe fighters in fierce low-altitude dogfights. It was here that Ruderfer, the man considered too old, took to the air once more. And within 7 days, his name would echo through Luftwaffe radio channels, through Berlin propaganda offices, and across enemy lines. He would turn exhaustion into rhythm, doubt into fury, experience into destruction. And the skies of the Eastern Front, heavy, gray, and unrelenting, would bear witness to one of the most extraordinary aerial feats of the entire Second World War. Long before the frost-covered airfields of 1943, Erich Ruderfer had been one of the Luftwaffe's early prodigies. Born in Zwochau, Germany in 1917, he had grown up in the shadow of the First World War, in a country stripped of its pride, its military, and its hope. Like many of his generation, Ruderfer came of age in a nation obsessed with flight. The stories of the Red Baron, of aerial duels over Flanders, filled his boyhood imagination. By the time he joined the Luftwaffe in 1936, he was part of a new breed, men raised not on cavalry charges or trenches, but on the myth of the sky. When the war began in September 1939, Ruderfer flew with JG-2 Richthofen, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings. He scored his first victory over France in May 1940, a French Curtiss Hawk fighter, and within months he was dueling with RAF Spitfires over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain. He was young, confident, and fast. But by 1942, everything had changed. The Luftwaffe had expanded far beyond its limits. The air war now spanned thousands of miles, from the icy skies of Norway to the sands of North Africa. Pilots were transferred constantly, and Ruderfer found himself flying in the North African desert with JG-2, supporting Rommel's Afrika Korps. There, in the endless sun and swirling dust, he learned the art of survival, conserving ammunition, mastering deflection shooting, reading the light. He became known among comrades not just for accuracy, but for patience, a pilot who never wasted energy or emotion. Yet by 1943, that very patience made him suspect in the eyes of command. The Luftwaffe was desperate for youthful aggression. The propaganda machine idolized the 19-year-old ace, reckless, heroic, willing to die for the Reich. Ruderfer, now approaching 30, didn't fit that mold. He spoke openly about poor leadership, exhausted men, and the futility of endless combat rotations. He questioned Göring's inflated victory claims and the unrealistic expectations placed upon fighter wings that were losing pilots faster than replacements arrived. For that honesty, he was quietly pushed aside. By mid-1943, Ruderfer was reassigned as a flight instructor, training cadets who barely understood the basics of aerial combat. He watched inexperienced boys take off, crash, and die before even reaching combat altitude. It was demoralizing, a purgatory for a man built for action. But history has a way of recalling its best soldiers when the fire burns hottest. In August 1943, as the Eastern Front crumbled under the Soviet advance, the Luftwaffe recalled several experienced pilots to frontline duty. Ruderfer was one of them. He was posted to Taubromechite JG-54, a veteran unit fighting from forward airfields in the Baltic region. JG-54 had once been home to legends, men like Walter Nowotny and Otto Kittel, both top-scoring aces of the war. But by the time Ruderfer arrived, the squadron was a shadow of its former self. The once proud Green Hearts flew patched-up aircraft with bullet holes covered by thin metal plates. Their mechanics worked in the mud, engines often failing mid-flight. Ammunition and fuel were rationed. When Ruderfer walked into the squadron mess for the first time, several younger pilots looked up and exchanged smirks. They had heard the rumors. The old man from the training unit. Too slow, too careful, too past his time. But Ruderfer said nothing. He simply hung his flight jacket, nodded to his commander, and took a seat near the window. He had learned long ago that war doesn't reward talk. It rewards endurance. In the following weeks, he flew sparingly. Poor weather grounded many missions. But when he did fly, his precision was unmistakable. He led patrols through blinding snow, hunted Soviet reconnaissance planes, and always returned with his aircraft intact, something few others could say. Still, the doubts persisted. Then came November 6, 1943. A sudden Soviet offensive burst from the forests around Vitebsk, supported by dozens of fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe scrambled what few aircraft it could muster. Ruderfer was among them, his FW-190A6 barely fueled, its machine guns half loaded. He climbed into the cockpit, as he had hundreds of times before. But that day, something shifted. Perhaps it was frustration, months of being overlooked. Perhaps it was instinct, the old killer's rhythm returning. Whatever it was, by the end of that sortie, he had downed 6 enemy aircraft in a single mission. By nightfall, his name was back on the board. By the end of the week, it would be carved into legend, and what began as an act of defiance from a too-old pilot would soon become one of the most staggering displays of aerial combat skill in history. In the Luftwaffe, the cockpit was not a place for weakness. Men were expected to fight with mechanical precision, emotionless, detached, and efficient. Yet beneath the polished discipline and medals, the human body and mind were quietly breaking. By late 1943, Erich Ruderfer had been at war for 4 years, a lifetime in fighter pilot terms. Most pilots never survived past their first 10 missions. Ruderfer had flown over 600. Every takeoff, every dogfight, every engine scream added another layer of fatigue to his bones. His body carried the memory of every dive, every hard turn, every blackout from G-forces that pressed blood from his brain. He was not an old man by any civilian measure. He was 28. But in the Luftwaffe, that made him ancient. The average pilot in his squadron was barely 21. They were quick, aggressive, fearless, but also inexperienced and often reckless. Ruderfer had once been like them. Now he was something else entirely, deliberate, methodical, and aware of how close death always hovered. Among his younger comrades, there was a silent tension. They respected his experience, but mocked his restraint. They flew with bravado. He flew with calculation. They dove into combat head-on. He circled, waited, and struck when his opponent had already made his fatal mistake. It was not the style of flying the Luftwaffe celebrated anymore, but it was the style that kept him alive. He had learned, through years of survival, that war rewards rhythm. The best pilots didn't chase kills, they built sequences. Every move had a purpose, every maneuver a contingency. Ruderfer's flying was less about speed and more about tempo, a deadly dance where timing meant everything. That instinct came from experience, but also from exhaustion. By this stage of the war, pilots were not rotated out for rest. They flew until they broke, physically, mentally, or permanently. Sleep was a rumor, food, rationed and cold. The endless cold air, the smell of oil and sweat, and the drone of engines became their world. And through it all, Ruderfer remained unnervingly calm. Fellow pilots later said he rarely raised his voice. He moved with the composure of a surgeon, even during takeoff under fire. He had developed an almost meditative detachment, not because he lacked fear, but because he had learned to master it. Fear, he knew, was fuel. It sharpened focus, slowed time, and reminded you that survival depended on the smallest details. A flicker in the clouds, a vibration under the seat, a shadow on the horizon. But beneath that calm was a man deeply aware of the futility of it all. He had seen too many good men burn. He had seen wings torn from fuselages, parachutes opened too late, and young pilots vanish into the snow. He knew he was not fighting for victory anymore. Germany's collapse was inevitable. Even from a cockpit, it was visible in the sky. The The Soviet aircraft formations grew larger every week, German replacements fewer. The war had turned from conquest to endurance. Yet, Ruderfer kept flying. Not for glory, not even for belief, but for mastery, for the craft itself. There is a strange paradox that comes in the later years of war. When survival becomes routine, killing becomes mechanical. Ruderfer's mind operated like an engineer's, calculating angles, trajectories, and timing in fractions of a second. But even he could feel the ghost of conscience pressing somewhere deep inside, unspoken, unacknowledged. In his post-war reflections, he rarely spoke about emotions. He spoke about technique, tactics, aerodynamics, anything but the human cost. And yet, buried between those lines was the quiet truth of a man who knew too much of death to celebrate it. In that week of November 1943, when he would down 27 aircraft, Ruderfer's endurance was not just physical, it was mental. He compartmentalized everything. He treated combat like mathematics, not mayhem. He had to, because to feel too much in those skies was to lose focus, and to lose focus was to die. Still, there was one human factor he could never suppress, his instinct to protect. The younger pilots, the boys, as he called them, often clung to his formation in battle. Ruderfer would cover their blind spots, break formation to save one from a tailing enemy, and take risks that defied his careful reputation. Those small, silent acts of guardianship spoke more of who he was than any number of kills. They also showed the contradiction of his legend, a man capable of terrifying lethality, yet still grounded in a soldier's code of loyalty. That was the human engine driving him: experience, exhaustion, empathy, and a cold clarity forged in fire. And when that mixture met the chaos of Soviet air power in November 1943, it created something the world had never seen, a week of destruction that seemed almost impossible. But to understand how he achieved it, we must look beyond the man, into the machine that carried him, and the tactical science behind every kill. If the man was the mind, then the machine was his heartbeat. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A-6, the aircraft Ruderfer flew during that November of 1943, was one of the most formidable fighter machines ever built. To those who knew how to use it, it was not merely a tool of war, but an extension of instinct. The FW-190 had been designed by Kurt Tank, a pragmatic engineer who believed that beauty meant nothing if it could not survive battle. Unlike the sleek, elegant lines of the British Spitfire or the American Mustang, the FW-190 was brutish, compact, and heavily armored. It looked like it had been forged from iron rather than crafted from aluminum, a fighter born for the brutal air wars of the Eastern Front. Where the Messerschmitt Bf-109 was light and nimble, the FW-190 was muscular, a machine that could dive faster, roll harder, and take more punishment than anything the Soviets could field. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced over 1,700 horsepower, allowing it to climb with tremendous acceleration. The cockpit sat high, giving its pilot excellent visibility, a critical advantage when dogfights twisted and turned mere meters above the snow. For Ruderfer, who had flown almost every major Luftwaffe fighter since 1939, the FW-190 was a revelation. He once remarked that it felt alive, responsive, stable, and brutally direct. In the frozen skies over Vitebsk, the Soviets fielded swarms of Yak-9s, LA-5s, and Il-2 Sturmoviks, each formidable in its own right, but inferior in one key area: survivability. The Yak and La series were nimble but fragile. The Il-2, the infamous flying tank, could absorb punishment, but was slow and clumsy in turns. Ruderfer understood this balance instinctively. He knew that speed was not everything. Timing was. The FW-190 allowed him to dictate the fight. It could climb out of danger, dive to attack, and hammer through enemy formations with its quad 20mm cannons and twin 13mm machine guns. When those guns spoke, Soviet aircraft disintegrated under their fire, but the weapon was only as deadly as the man behind it. Ruderfer's flying style was built on tactical economy, a kind of aerial chess. He rarely engaged in prolonged turning battles. Instead, he struck from above, diving into enemy formations, taking a single precise burst, and then rolling away into the clouds. He would climb again, assess, and strike once more. This was known among German pilots as boom and zoom, a tactic that relied on altitude, surprise, and perfect energy management. On the Eastern Front, where visibility could change by the minute, it was an art form. Rudolfer also made full use of the FW-190's roll rate, the fastest of any fighter in the world at that time. This allowed him to evade attacks that would have destroyed a slower aircraft. Soviet pilots often found themselves firing at him, only to see the German fighter roll away at impossible angles, vanishing behind clouds or diving straight into the glare of the winter sun. And then, seconds later, he was on their tail. What made Rudolfer's one-week streak so astonishing was not just the number of kills, but the context. He was not operating with air superiority. He was outnumbered 5, sometimes 10 to 1. His airfields were half frozen, his fuel limited, and his aircraft maintained by exhausted mechanics who worked through the night in freezing wind. Yet he flew multiple sorties per day. Luftwaffe doctrine demanded aggression, but Rudolfer applied it with precision. He would often take off alone or with one wingman, intercept Soviet formations, and strike at their weakest points. His combat reports from that week are short and clinical. One Il-2 destroyed at 1,200 meters. 2 Yak-9s at 1,000 meters. Visibility poor. The language of routine efficiency. But to his comrades on the ground, it was anything but routine. Every landing was followed by disbelief. Each sortie seemed to multiply his score. The mechanics began keeping a rough tally in chalk on the fuselage of his FW-190. Within days, the numbers seemed unreal. By November 13th, Rudolfer had recorded 27 aerial victories, all confirmed by ground observers. No pilot in JG-54's history had ever matched that pace. Not even Nowotny, the legendary ace of the same unit. To understand how such numbers were possible, one must remember the chaos of the eastern skies. Air battles were not isolated duels, but sprawling, multi-layered melees. Dozens of aircraft twisting, climbing, and diving through smoke and sunlight. In that confusion, a single pilot with exceptional awareness could strike repeatedly, unseen, as others focused elsewhere. Rudolfer's mastery of situational awareness was unmatched. He read the battlefield as if from above, always aware of the larger picture. His calm voice over the radio often guided younger pilots out of danger while he engaged multiple enemies at once. The Luftwaffe later used his performance as propaganda, the old ace reborn, the hero of Vitebsk. But within the squadron, men spoke of it differently. They called it der Tanz des Teufels, the devil's dance. Because to watch Rudolfer fight that week was to witness something mechanical and human intertwined. The cold precision of technology meeting the raw will of survival. He was no longer simply a pilot. He had become an instrument, man and machine, moving in absolute unity. And that unity would soon face its ultimate test, when the skies themselves seemed to turn against him. The week began like so many others on the Eastern Front, cold, gray, and uncertain. It was November 6th, 1943. The airfield at Vitebsk lay half buried in frost. Mechanics worked with bare, cracked hands, warming tools over small fires. The Focke-Wulf FW-190s sat in a line like frozen predators, their camouflage dulled by ice. The pilots moved through the ritual of preparation in silence, checking weapons, strapping on harnesses, glancing at the dull horizon where the next battle would rise. The Soviets had launched a new push that morning. Reconnaissance reports spoke of dozens of Il-2 Sturmovix, escorted by Yak-9 fighters, striking German ground positions. It was a typical Soviet tactic: overwhelm, saturate, and crush. The Luftwaffe's response: send what few aircraft they had left into the storm. Rudolfer's name was on the flight roster. Squadron Commander Hauptmann Hans Philipp had hesitated before assigning him, not because he doubted his skill, but because the mission was suicide. Still, Rudolfer insisted. He walked to his aircraft without a word, brushed a thin layer of frost from the cockpit glass, and climbed in. At 10:23 a.m., his engine roared to life. The runway cracked under the frozen wheels. As he lifted off, the clouds above opened to reveal a pale sun, cold light spilling across the snow. The first engagement came within minutes. 20 Soviet aircraft, flying in tight formation, passed below. Rutherford dove. His FW-190 shuddered as the cannons roared, 4 20mm shells ripping through the formation. An Il-2 burst into flames, spiraling into the forest below. Before the others could react, he rolled left, diving through the chaos and claiming a second kill. His radio remained silent. He preferred it that way. Over the next 10 minutes, he weaved through the melee, striking, climbing, vanishing. 2 Yak-9s fell in quick succession, then another Il-2. His ammo counter ticked lower with every burst, but his movements remained measured, almost choreographed. By the time he returned to base, his guns were empty. He had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, alone. When his FW-190 touched down, ground crews rushed to meet him. He said nothing, simply removed his gloves, nodded once, and walked toward the operations tent. Inside, he wrote his after-action report by hand, each line clinical, without emotion. That night, word spread through the camp, 6 kills in 1 sortie. A feat that even the most optimistic propaganda officers would have hesitated to invent. But Rudorfer wasn't finished. The next day, November 7th, dawned with thick fog and freezing wind. Flights were delayed for hours. When visibility improved, Soviet formations appeared again, moving low and fast, a sign they were preparing another strike. The Luftwaffe scrambled. Rudorfer's squadron took off into churning clouds. The fog swallowed everything. Visibility dropped to a few hundred meters. In that chaos, even finding the enemy was a miracle. But at 2,000 meters, his radio crackled. Contact ahead. Moments later, shadows moved through the mist. LA-5s, fast and heavy, diving through the clouds. The sky erupted. Rudorfer banked hard, fired, and 1 LA-5 disintegrated in a burst of smoke. Another swept past, guns flashing. Bullets tore across his wing. He rolled, countered, and fired a single burst. A flash, a hit, 2 more kills. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sky cleared. The Soviets were gone. He returned with 4 confirmed victories. The ground crews had begun to chalk numbers onto the fuselage of his aircraft, small white marks near the cockpit. It had become a quiet ritual, every kill added to the legend. 12 in 2 days. By November 9th, the Eastern Front had erupted into a storm of steel and fire. The Soviet Air Force, sensing weakness, sent larger formations. The Luftwaffe scrambled again and again, sometimes 3 times in 1 day. Fuel was rationed, ammunition low. But Rudorfer flew each sortie with the same cold focus. That day, he claimed 7 kills, Yak-9s, LA-5s, and 1 PE-2 bomber. He landed with his guns nearly melted from heat. When he stepped from the cockpit, even the young pilots, those who had once laughed about the old man, stood silent. One of them, barely 20, whispered to a mechanic, "He doesn't fight like us. He hunts." By midweek, Rudorfer had 17 confirmed victories in less than 4 days. Commanders were sending urgent messages to Berlin. Even the propaganda ministry took notice. Reports of his unbelievable streak began circulating through radio broadcasts. But within JG-54, the mood was quiet, almost somber. They knew what such intensity cost. Every takeoff carried the same question. How long could he keep surviving it? The answer would come in the days ahead, when the Soviet Air Force, realizing his presence, began to hunt him in return. Because on the Eastern Front, legends never went unchallenged. By November 12, 1943, Erich Rudorfer had become both a weapon and a myth. His squadron, battered, undersupplied, and running on adrenaline, now looked to him as their anchor. The ground crews began calling his aircraft Der Eiserne Vogel, the Iron Bird. But every flight was taking something from him. His eyes ached from scanning the horizon. His neck burned from hours pressed against the headrest under G-force. His hearing had dulled from the roar of engines and gunfire. He barely slept. Coffee had replaced rest. Discipline had replaced emotion. The war had narrowed to a simple cycle: climb, fight, survive, land, reload, repeat. That morning, as dawn broke over Vitebsk, Soviet formations were already in the air. The Red Air Force had been alerted to a German ace wreaking havoc along their sector. Commanders ordered concentrated sweeps to intercept and destroy him. Dozens of fighters, Yak-9s, LA-5s, and Il-2 ground attack aircraft, moved through the air like a cloud of hornets. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. Ruderfer was the first to take off. His FW-190's engine coughed in the cold, then steadied into a thunderous growl. He pulled the throttle forward and lifted into a gray, endless sky. Minutes later, he sighted movement ahead. 20-plus Soviet aircraft, flying low over the forest. His oxygen mask hissed as he breathed. His gloved fingers rested on the trigger. The attack came like lightning. He dove through the formation, cannons blazing. An Il-2 exploded beneath him, debris scattering across the snow below. He climbed, rolled, and came down again on a Yak-9's tail. One burst, and the fighter shattered. Another came at him head-on. He pulled up, rolled inverted, and struck again. 3 kills in under a minute. The radio filled with chaotic shouts, German voices, Soviet curses, static. Ruderfer ignored them all. He was in the zone now, that narrow mental tunnel where time slows and instinct takes command. At 2,000 meters, he caught another pair of Yak-9s circling a damaged German aircraft. He closed the distance in seconds. The first fell in flames. The second tried to climb, but Ruderfer's burst caught its engine squarely. Smoke, then silence. 5 kills. He dove again, this time through a mass of Il-2s strafing German ground troops. The FW-190's guns spat fire. One Sturmovik fell apart mid-air. Another veered sharply and crashed into the tree line. The rest scattered. 7 kills. But the Soviets were not running anymore. They were hunting. 3 LA-5s appeared from the sun, diving straight at him. Ruderfer rolled right, then left, cutting between them so close he could see the red stars painted on their wings. He yanked hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing his chest. His vision blurred, tunneling to gray. He fired blind. One short burst. When his vision cleared, 1 LA-5 was falling in smoke. 8, fuel low. Ammo nearly gone. He turned toward base, and that's when he saw it. Another wave. At least a dozen Soviet aircraft, approaching fast. He could have retreated. No one would have blamed him, but instead, he banked sharply, leveled his wings, and went back in. The next 5 minutes became legend. Ruderfer weaved through the formation, firing with brutal precision. Soviet pilots broke formation in panic, shouting warnings across radios. He downed a Yak, then another. A bomber fell apart under his cannons. He climbed, dove, twisted, and fired until his guns clicked empty. When he finally broke off, the sky was littered with smoke trails and burning wrecks. He landed just before noon. His FW-190's fuselage was scorched, its wings peppered with bullet holes. He climbed out slowly, his legs trembling from fatigue. Mechanics and officers ran toward him, shouting, asking for numbers. He said nothing at first, then, quietly, 13. That day, Ruderfer had destroyed 13 Soviet aircraft in a single sortie. In 1 week, 27 confirmed kills. It was a record no pilot in JG-54, and few in all of World War II, would ever match. Word spread like fire. Reports reached Berlin within hours. Propaganda leaflets hailed him as Der Jäger des Ostens, the hunter of the East. Yet among his squadron, celebration felt hollow. The young pilots watched him sit silently by his aircraft, his face drawn, eyes distant. Because the truth was simple. No man could sustain that kind of perfection forever. The body breaks. The mind fractures. And even Ruderfer, for all his control, could feel it, the invisible weight pressing closer with every flight. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ruins of Vitebsk, the airfield fell quiet. The engines cooled. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Ruderfer stood alone beside his FW-190, the last warmth of the day fading from the metal skin of the machine. He placed one hand on its fuselage, a gesture not of triumph, but of understanding. He had survived another day. He had outflown time itself, but in the silence that followed, even victory felt like loss. By the time November faded into December 1943, the story of Erich Ruderfer's seven-day rampage had traveled far beyond the frozen forests of Vitebsk. In a war where victories were growing rare and the skies increasingly hostile, his feat offered the Luftwaffe something it desperately needed: proof that its aces still ruled the air. The first official reports reached Berlin within 48 hours. Teleprinter messages clattered through the Air Ministry's corridors. 2. JG-54, 27 enemy aircraft destroyed by Oberleutnant Rudorfer between 6 to 13 November. In a city now darkened by nightly Allied raids, such news was treated like oxygen. The propaganda ministry, under Joseph Goebbels, seized the story instantly. Newspapers published bold headlines: "Veteran pilot destroys 27 Bolshevik aircraft in 1 week." "Experience defies youth. The iron nerves of the Green Hearts." Ruderfer's name joined the pantheon of the Luftwaffe's living legends: Nowotny, Kittel, Hartmann. His photograph appeared in Signal magazine, a lean-faced pilot beside the scorched nose of an FW-190, snow at his boots, the chalk marks of his victories bright against dark metal. But behind the imagery, reality remained grim. Even as Berlin celebrated him, JG-54 was barely holding together. Fuel shortages grounded half the squadron's aircraft. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer than 10 hours of flight time. Soviet pressure increased daily. For every victory, 2 more enemy machines seemed to rise from the east. To the men on the line, Ruderfer's achievement was both inspiration and warning. It proved what skill could still accomplish, but also what was required to achieve it: relentless risk, total focus, and a willingness to face death again and again. Commanders across the Eastern Front began citing his name in briefings. "Fly like Rudorfer," they said, though most knew no one could. His discipline was forged from years of survival, not training manuals. The Soviet response came not in speeches, but in strategy. Intelligence reports from Red Air Force units near Vitebsk mention of German ace-hunting Sturmovix. Orders went out to change formation patterns, to vary altitude, to avoid clustering during ground attack runs. Ruderfer had forced the enemy to adapt, a rare feat for a single pilot. On December 6th, a formal commendation arrived at his airfield. He was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest decorations. A courier flew in through sleet and flak to deliver it personally. The ceremony was brief. A field officer read the citation aloud. A photographer took one frame. Ruderfer stood motionless, the metal pinned to his flight jacket, frost glinting on the silver edges. There was no celebration that night. He joined his ground crew for soup and black bread, then returned to his quarters, a wooden hut warmed by a single stove. Outside, snow drifted over the parked fighters like shrouds. He was proud, but not triumphant. Later, he would recall only one sentence from the commendation. His example demonstrates the power of experience and discipline in the defense of the Reich. To him, it was less praise than prophecy. The Reich was already collapsing, and experience, not ideology, would decide who survived its fall. Within weeks, Ruderfer was flying again, defending retreating German columns across the Baltic. His reputation preceded him wherever he landed. Mechanics treated his aircraft like a relic. New pilots whispered his name with awe. But to Ruderfer himself, the legend meant little. He had seen the truth behind the numbers: the wreckage burning on both sides, the parachutes drifting down into endless snow. For every kill, another young man had vanished into smoke. Berlin wanted heroes. The front lines produced ghosts. And though his 27 kills in 1 week would enter the record books as one of the most remarkable individual feats of the war, it would also mark the beginning of the Luftwaffe's final descent, proof that brilliance alone could no longer save a dying force. As winter deepened, Ruderfer's streak became a story soldiers told to keep faith, a reminder that mastery could still exist amid chaos. But even then, everyone knew. No ace, no machine, no medal could turn back the tide now rolling toward Germany. The eastern sky that had carried him to glory was already darkening for good. The war did not end for Erich Ruderfer with his 27th kill. It merely carried him onward, deeper into a twilight world, where skill and survival were all that remained. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was disintegrating. The Allied bombing campaign had crippled German fuel production, and the Eastern Front consumed both men and machines faster than they could be replaced. The once dominant air arm of the Reich had become a desperate, scattered force, fragments of glory fighting against inevitability. Ruderfer's unit, JG-54, continued to retreat westward. Airfields were abandoned under fire, aircraft destroyed to prevent capture. Still, he flew. In the chaos of the retreat, he was transferred between fronts, first the Baltic, then East Prussia, and later the defense of the Reich against Allied bombers. By now, he was one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces. His tally passed 200, then 220, then beyond. But to him, the numbers had become meaningless. Each sortie blurred into the next, a continuous rhythm of takeoff, combat, and survival. When the Allies invaded France in June 1944, Ruderfer was briefly assigned to intercept bomber formations over Germany. He once claimed to have destroyed 10 Allied bombers in a single mission, though records suggest fewer. It hardly mattered. The Luftwaffe was collapsing under overwhelming odds. In those final months, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies by day and the Soviets by night. German pilots fought from crumbling airfields, often launching into battle without radio contact or reliable fuel. Yet Ruderfer, remarkably, endured. In March 1945, he was appointed Gruppenkommandeur, Group Commander, of Wumseste JG-7, Germany's first operational jet fighter wing, flying the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262. It was a glimpse of the future, sleek, fast, unlike anything else in the sky. But it came too late to change the course of the war. Even in those final, desperate days, Ruderfer demonstrated the same precision that had defined him in 1943. Flying the Me 262, he downed several Allied aircraft, including American bombers, despite the overwhelming enemy presence and chaos of retreating German forces. On May 8, 1945, the war ended. Germany surrendered. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Ruderfer destroyed his last aircraft on the runway before it could fall into Allied hands. Then, with the same calm that had guided him through years of combat, he walked away. He was taken prisoner by British forces and held until 1946. Unlike many of his comrades, he was never charged with war crimes, nor did he show bitterness in captivity. When asked later about the war, his answers were terse, factual, and emotionless. He spoke of tactics, engines, and formations, never of ideology. When he was finally released, Ruderfer returned to a Germany reduced to rubble. The world he had known, the Luftwaffe, the bases, the endless skies, was gone. He found work as a commercial pilot, flying for Lufthansa, the new German airline that emerged in the 1950s. For the first time, his flying carried passengers instead of weapons. Those who met him in later years described a quiet man, courteous, professional, disciplined.